Hello and welcome to Radio Abundance. We are here with Alex Trembath. He's the Deputy Director of the Breakthrough Institute, and this is his second appearance on Radio Abundance. Hey, Alex, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me back, Steve.
Hey, we are thrilled that you're back. We had an amazing conversation maybe about 2 months ago. The Breakthrough Institute, it was very early to the world of abundance, and long before abundance had a name, with fingers in a lot of areas, but especially energy and the environment, and really sending out a call to the world that our approach to the environment was neither helping the environment or ourselves. And so proposing a better route through, I think, what you call eco-modernism in terms of how we can build a greener world, a more energy efficient world, while also lowering the cost of energy and making it easier for people to live where they want to live and live near where they work, and building a world with more energy, more food, and a better environment for all of us and all of every creature on Earth. So that a reasonably accurate description?
That was great.
Amazing. So that last conversation, which I will link to because it was phenomenal, we talked about the origins of the Breakthrough Institute. We talked about your work in energy. We talked quite a lot about nuclear energy and safety, and we went through different nuclear accidents and talked about why it was safe and really analyzed them. And so it's a really phenomenal conversation, one of my favorites. We're not going to retread old ground, but highly recommend that. So we were really excited to talk more because there's so much to this area. You also work on things like agriculture and food, which we're really excited to talk about abundance when it comes to food. But you're also doing events, and in fact, our audience may have heard of, may also be about to attend the Abundance Conference in DC, and you're one of the big, if not, biggest maybe, or one of the key organizers, producers of that. So I figured we'd start
Team
there.
effort.
So let's start with just what it is, right? To anybody who is not already initiated, does not already have their ticket, what's the Abundance Conference?
Yeah, we're really excited about it. It's 2 weeks from today, as we're recording. It's September 4th and 5th in Washington D.C. This is really sort of the kind of national gathering of the broad abundance movement that all your listeners know and love at this point. There's 15 think tank and activist co-hosts. A number of sponsors as well. We're going to have over 500 people there from kind of every walk of life. We're going to have think tankers and journalists and philanthropists and advocates and activists and investors and technologists and elected officials at the state, national, and local level. Sort of our hope is that this becomes the kind of annual convening of the abundance movement. This is the second time that we're doing this event. We launched a kind of pilot abundance conference in DC last year that we all really loved, and wanted to do it again and make it bigger and make it better. I've been doing events for over 10 years. I won't say it's not hard. It is hard work, sort of logistically, substantively, but it wasn't hard to kind of build interest for this event. Let me say that we sold out 6 weeks in advance. I apologize. We have a waiting list of I think over 200 people at this point. My hope is that we can accommodate more people and ideas in the future. But for this year's event, we're really excited. We're going to cover housing, obviously, energy, infrastructure, artificial intelligence, healthcare, immigration, families, sort of state capacity, governance, on and on and on. The kind of wide swath of the abundance agenda. We got some pretty incredible speakers lined up, and I'm just really excited.
And you mentioned incredible speakers. You got some amazing speakers, some amazing partners. Give us some razzmatazz for a second. Let's name drop a little bit. Who's coming?
Yeah, so obviously 2025 is the year of the publication of Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. Derek Thompson, who really coins the term the abundance agenda in 2021, which was kind of a Rubicon for a bunch of us, right? Like we talked in our last conversation, Steve, about how a bunch of us within Abundance, including like Breakthrough and the YIMBY movement and organizations like Niskanen, had been doing kind of abundancy stuff for years or more. Federation of American Scientists is a co-host on this event, and they've been operating for over half a century at this point, right? On a whole bunch of stuff related to sort of nuclear and science and technology. But it really was just over the last few years that we all kind of found each other in this new context under this new tent called Abundance. So we're thrilled that David Brooks from the New York Times is going to be interviewing Ezra and Derek about their book and their reaction to it over the last 6 months or so. We're also thrilled to have, dozens of elected officials from around the country, including a number of members of Congress who will be on stage, as well as representatives from state legislatures and mayors and local representatives from city councils and local government. And we're also thrilled to have the governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, is going to come talk about what abundance looks like in his home state of Utah. So those are a few of the sort of big sort of keynotes that we're excited to have planned for this year's conference. And then beyond that, we, again, like I said, we've got 15 co-hosts, a bunch of sort of philanthropic and other sponsors focused on a range of issues that I could never hope to sort of program in my many years of planning and executing kind of climate and environment focused conferences. Like I said, we've got like the Institute for Progress, so helping us figure out a panel on immigration, and Federation of American Scientists spearheading a panel on the next golden age of American science and science investment. We've got the Niskanen Center, sort of helping us with a panel on families. We've got the whole sort of YIMBY movement, Welcoming Neighbors Network, Metropolitan Abundance Project, the Abundance Network, YIMBY Action, sort of collaborating on a session, sort of sharing lessons from what worked for communications and organizing in the housing sector to what might work in other sort of abundance sectors like energy or infrastructure or things like that. So it really, I'm really sort of just scratching the surface here. It's a lot of partners, a lot of sweat equity, a lot of ideas, a lot to be excited about.
And you mentioned, you've been throwing events before. This is something we share and love, and we will talk about the importance of events in a second. But you mentioned you've been, you've had a decade of experience throwing events in the world of energy and climate and the environment. So going back to last year, so pre-Rubicon, we're back in Gaul. How did this come together in the first place? Because 15 partners and co-producers, or however you want to call it, that's a big number to come out of the gate with that. So going back to last year, what was the origin story of kicking this off?
Yeah, so it was in the a few years ago that I kind of ended up in conversations with folks from some of these co-hosts, just talking about what it would look like and what the purpose and strategy of an abundance gathering in our nation's capital would look like. What should we and why would we sort of convene to co-host an abundance conference in DC. And I was talking with folks again from like the Institute for Progress and the Foundation for American Innovation and the Niskanen Center about, this sort of realization that we are all kind of marching to the same tune. We are, with significant kind of substantive and even ideological differences between us, all kind of part of this abundance coalition, this abundance movement. And last year, really, I and Derek Kaufman, who founded Inclusive Abundance in 2024, kind of spearheaded the first abundance conference in DC with, along with our with four other co-hosts: the Federation of American Scientists, Institute for Progress, Niskanen Center, and the Foundation for American Innovation. It went really well. It was, sort of 6 co-hosts, a bunch of sessions and panels. We had, folks who were at the time working in the Biden administration, and we had, Jerusalem Demsas, who this week launched a new magazine interviewing Patrick Collison, sort of one of the both sort of benefactors, but also kind of visionaries behind the progress and abundance movements. And it just really felt in that event like kind of momentum was building. And, a bunch of us wanted to do it again, expand the tent, kind of democratize the effort. So, going into this year, we went from 6 to 15 co-hosts. I think last year's headcount was something like 250 people, sort of max fill in the room. This year we've got almost 600 people, and like I said, there's honestly hundreds more people who want to come. So I don't know exactly where this thing is going, but it really does feel like a sort of significant building inertia behind behind abundance generally, and behind a significant kind of groundswell of folks who want to show up in person, like you were saying, Steve, who want to gather and see each other and meet each other and sort of celebrate abundance victories, and also I think sort of hash out our differences and sort of tensions across the sort of ideological and political spectrum that spans abundance. And that's really, my kind of substantive interest in this event is putting, kind of like-minded and sort of civically minded people in a room together, and sort of hashing out our strengths and our weaknesses and our commonalities and our differences.
A pretty huge leap, right? You had 6 partners last year, this year 15, so that is 250%. You also mentioned last year had about 250 people. This year, not only did you set out and go, we're going to double that, but then you sold out well ahead of the conference and have about the size of last year's headcount on your waiting list. So you have about 300% of what you had last year in terms of people that want to go, and will double it in terms of people who actually can go. In terms of, what people can expect and get out of the event, you've started this already. So obviously you go, you have fun. Obviously you learn things. Obviously you see people you've heard of and meet them. But you mentioned, I thought this was a really interesting way to start, which is the idea of like coming in from different perspectives. So this is an event for people on the left, the right, the center, every weird where in between. And I love that you mentioned there's a place to come together and be like, all right, what do we agree on? What do we disagree on? And where are the differences and things that we can work out, merge, understand each other better? Those kind of things that can only happen when you do actually trust each other enough to be in the same room together and talk to each other. So I thought that was really exciting. In your world and life as an event producer, this conference and everything you've done before, why do events? What does this do for people? You've named a few things, and I'm just curious about the power of events, and it's a lot of work. Why do this work?
Yeah, so part of the reason you're talking to me about this is because not wholly unique among the co-hosts, but particularly among the co-hosts, Breakthrough kind of had the kind of talent and infrastructure and the team in place to throw a conference. Again, that's not sort of an exclusive strength of ours, but it's something that we have done and we think done well for well over a decade. Is put on events. We've got an events team. We've got relationships with sort of vendors and all the software that goes into throwing a sort of multi-hundred person event. And we had the interest and passion for this invigorating but sort of challenging work of putting on a conference, and that comes from myself and my colleague Thea Bonadiaz, the Abundance Conference's producer, working together for sort of many years at this point, working really hard to bring people together who don't see eye to eye on things, and to kind of hash out disagreements, tensions, differences, both in sort of hopefully well planned, well staged, sort of moderated discussion, but also all the really important kind of off the stage, informal sort of programming conversation that happens sort of organically at events. And that was, like events and convening were super important to us at Breakthrough over the last almost 2 decades that we have been operating, because we saw ourselves as offering and building a new philosophy for thinking about the environment, for thinking about the relationship between nature, humans, and technology. And we couldn't do that just ourselves, the sort of staff of the Breakthrough Institute. We relied on expertise, and we relied on feedback, and we relied on sort of Socratic sort of discussion of the sort of constituent parts of what became eco-modernism. So it was just really part of Breakthrough's DNA, that sort of bringing people together, across disciplines and across differences, kind of helps shape and build momentum, but also discipline a framework, a philosophy, a movement. And now working with all the co-hosts of Abundance, and the co-chairs of the conference, Jen Polka and Zach Graves, and the program committee, and everyone who has gone, who has sort of volunteered time and energy and money to, and sort of financial support for the conference to make it what it is. I think just sort of reinforces, to me, that the value of bringing people together in person, and kind of like forcing yourselves to create a program, to create a session on immigration, or to create a session on energy abundance, or to create a session on overcoming scarcity in the U.S. healthcare system. Like, when you actually have to not only kind of put your brain to that task, but put multiple brains and multiple kind of institutional imperatives behind that task. You really kind of force yourself to hash out what you believe, why you believe it, what the evidence base is for your sort of policy or political program. Again, I think that's true across issues and across subject matter. Obviously, I and we organizers of Abundance 2025 are not the first persons to realize that workshops or colloquia or conferences are powerful in that way. But I think they are. And I guess the last thing I would say about it is I find myself thinking that events like this are increasingly important, actually, in a world where we have a kind of fractured media landscape, and a kind of like no hope of building a kind of shared infosphere, and broken attention spans at the personal and institutional level. I think that we should do a whole bunch of stuff to combat all of that. But one of the things I think we should do is spend more time together in person.
Oh, I had promised myself we were coming up against the limit of how much we could talk about events before we got to energy. I have to restrain myself. But then you mentioned, I think, a really important point. Events have always been important in politics. They've never stopped being important. But I agree. I think they're suddenly more important than they've been, and they still will be. And you named a few reasons why, and I'll give a few more, right? You named just the fact that our society is fractured. We get news from different places. We get our worldview from different places. And the only way to reconcile those things, instead of living in different realities and fighting with each other from different realities, is to merge them by being in the same place at the same time and talking to each other. That's one part of this and our fractured ecosystem. I would also say that's really related to, I think, what we call our loneliness crisis, which is very relevant to YIMBYism and abundance, because it's very hard not to be lonely when you don't live near each other, right? When you live in your little fortress and you have to drive 30, 40 minutes to see people, you end up, being in these little silos. And again, events are a panacea for that. And then I would say, obviously, the online space has gotten a little harried and corrupted, and we're only at the start, because whether you love AI, hate AI, or like me, sort of both, the world in which, I mean, you're just not going to be able to tell who on the internet is a person or not, right? Either a real person or not, or even like, is this Alex and Steve, or did Alex and Steve sort of outsource this interview to their representative AIs? Not right now, but I know people working on that and pitching that, right? Like, that's coming. So it seems to me the only way to know that you are talking with a person and dealing with people and living in the world of people, and politics is just people, is to be with people and to be present with them.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that, Steve. And it raises, I think, a really interesting kind of philosophical tension. Might be too strong a word to use, but a philosophical tension for those of us who kind of believe in progress, growth, abundance in the first place, which is that we are all sort of broadly, maybe not maximally, but sort of broadly on average, advocates of progress, of technology, of change. The whole sort of premise of YIMBYism is that the sort of existing community is not and should not be sort of sealed in amber, and that actually dynamism and change and growth are part of what makes a community vital. Same with energy, right? Like we were talking about the clean energy revolution, but the reality is that we have always been sort of revolutionizing and rebuilding and building over our energy system, and it's part of sort of what makes us human. It's sort of what makes us sort of growth and science and abundance advocates in the first place. And I think, and again, this isn't unique to abundance, but it is maybe particularly relevant to those of us so enamored of progress and technology. There is a kind of shared humanity and a shared community that I think all of us in society are increasingly sort of treasuring and frankly anxious about as we talk about sort of new media landscapes, as we talk about the hopeful, I agree with you, sort of productivity boom from artificial intelligence and all the new sort of tools and instruments and capabilities that we're developing with digital technologies, and as we talk about sort of ever more sort of globalized sort of culture and economy and society. I do think there is a kind of humanist and frankly at times sort of small c conservative need to cultivate cultivate sort of in-person interaction, to cultivate family, tribe, village, whatever you call it. And I don't really know what the resolution or the solution to that tension is, but I can tell you again that there is a sort of demonstrated mass desire to all get together in person and feel it and talk about it, including among, I think, a bunch of us who are generally, very optimistic about technological change and about dynamism. And I really find that that sort of tension really vital.
When we think about political parties, there's a word in there that I don't think gets enough attention, which is party. You want to, whether you want to do anything in politics or with people, you kind of got to throw a better party, and this is a good start. Let's segue though from this to the Breakthrough Institute and your portfolio, right? So if I go on your website and I look under our work, you list 5 topic areas where I think across the board you're saying, hey, how can we use better policy and better technology to create better results for the environment, better for the trees and the fish, and better for people in America, right? We can do better. One is climate and energy, all over that. Nuclear energy innovation, all over that. Environmental regulatory reform, all over that. And then you have 2 that I think are really interesting that I want to spend time on today. And one of them is food and agriculture, which I don't think gets enough attention in, politics in general, but in, even in the abundance space. I want to know a little bit more about eco-modernist, abundant food and agriculture. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so for our part, as the Breakthrough Institute, we see ourselves as making the environmental case for industrial agriculture. So if you think about sort of food and the environment, or sort of foodie environmentalism, or the slow food movement, over the last sort of half century or so. Remember Rachel Carson, sort of one of the founding figures of modern environmentalism, was writing largely about the use of organochloride pesticides and pollution from farm systems. So like the kind of concern and anxiety about the ecological effects of food production are really kind of hard coded into environmentalism. And that mostly has kind of manifest as a sort of environmental movement, sort of opposition to industrial agriculture, to factory farms. And there's good reason for that. When you talk about industrial agriculture, you're talking about sort of massive machines powered by fossil fuels. You're talking about synthetic fertilizers that are created by natural gas, as opposed to sort of created by waste products from livestock and from crop systems. You're talking about sort of nitrogen pollution from over application of fertilizers, creating dead zones in rivers and waterways. You're talking about sort of pumping up water from aquifers in the desert, and growing crops in places like California, where 400 years ago, if you had told the very few people who lived in California that the desert would one be the nation's breadbox, it would have been shocking. So obviously, agriculture has enormous environmental impacts. By some measures, the largest environmental impact of anything that humans do. Sort of over half of the ice-free land, or something like half the ice-free land on Earth is dedicated to growing food for humans. Actually, the bulk of that is grazing land for cattle and other ruminants, but a huge amount of it is also for crops that feed cattle, and also biofuels and food that humans actually eat. So it's the by far the leading driver of land use change around the world, much bigger than cities or even sort of mining and minerals production, much bigger, order of magnitude bigger than anything else we do. Um, and so the sort of environmental concern about the agricultural system is well founded. Our point of view is that all of the things that environmentalists have been telling us that we need to do to minimize our ecological impact from our food system would actually make it worse when you do the math. Organic food, organic agriculture uses only organic fertilizers and pesticides, which lead on average, and this is a really robust finding in the empirical literature, to lower yields. So you might have less pollution on a given acre of land, but you need more land to grow food, which leads to more deforestation. If you compare sort of synthetic versus organic fertilizers, to be a little reductive, you're talking about chemical fertilizers made in a factory using the Haber-Bosch process versus very often cattle manure. First of all, the synthetic fertilizers tend to produce less nitrogen pollution per area of application because you can be more precise. But another thing to remember is that cattle manure that does go into fertilizing organic farms, those cattle were mostly fed by industrially fed cows. The organic food system is really kind of floating on top of a bulk industrial food production system, without which it couldn't exist. And if you sort of do all the math behind the assumption that you do produce all your food with just organic inputs, then you end up using like over an India's worth of land extra in order to feed the population we have today, let alone the 1, 2, 3 billion more people that we're expecting to live on the planet by later this century. What we observe is that yes, sort of the environmental impact of the food system has been growing, over the centuries and millennia, but mostly because the population has been growing, and we need to feed everybody. In that time, the environmental footprint of an individual's agricultural demand has gone down dramatically. So, like, even with sort of high up the food chain, omnivorous diet, the land that is needed to sort of cultivate and grow my diet is like 10 times lower than what it would have been for someone living 1,000 years ago. And it's 50% lower than it was for like my great grandmother. Even in the last 100 years or so, where we've seen the sort of scaled deployment of irrigation and synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides and sort of multi-million-dollar GPS-guided combine tractors and sort of massive irrigation systems using pumped water from aquifers, we're using less land. We're actually using less water. We're using fewer inputs per capita to grow more food. And so that's sort of, maybe too many specific examples, but the long and the short of our view on what sustainable agriculture should look like. It should look like we're economizing on land and inputs to grow more food, using less land, sort of sparing, as we say, more of land area and nature for wild nature.
The history of food is addictively fascinating, and also I think at times terrifying. And check me on any of these facts and rein me in if we're going too deep on this, but I think of a number of things, right? First of all, the fact that like the stuff we're growing, all those fruits and veggies, that the natural stuff from the ground for humans to eat is not natural. That's not God given. That the Garden of Eden wouldn't have had apples. Fruits and veggies as we know them today are an invention. Like, humans made them. Like, people in the Americas created potatoes and yucca and corn and tomatoes, and it took a long time, but it's a human invention, all this stuff that we think of natural. And then you go to the world of fertilizer, right? For a long time in history, the best fertilizer was bones, human bones, right? If there's a battle near where you live and a bunch of people die, terrific news. Go gather bones, grind them up, and that's going to help grow your food. And then, post 1492, you get Europeans colonizing the Americas. And in South America, they went, whoa, this is weird. Why are all these South Americans going to this island to harvest bird poop and taking it up to the Andes to grow potatoes? And then people realize that actually bird poop is an incredible fertilizer. And you get things like the Guano Act in American law, which was like, if we find an island with bird poop on it, we can claim it to harvest the bird poop to grow food. And then, pesticides, when you talk about pesticides as an invention and synthetic, it's also an arms race. If you don't use pesticides, your whole crop can be wiped out. And that's just happened many times in the last few hundred years. But if you do use pesticides, you haven't suddenly invented your solution for the future. The bugs learn too. And by the next year, the next couple of years, they've adjusted, right? And so like you're constantly having to come out with a new escalating ways of keeping your food safe from the bugs as the bugs learn too. And it's that scares me. I am very curious how you think about when you talk about using less land. Is that stacking things? Is that artificial light? When you meat, do you like the idea of designer invented meat? What do you see as the future and the right solutions for this kind of thing?
Yeah, I think given the scale of agricultural production and the range in sort of productivity around the world, we're going to, and the sort of stubbornness of people's diets, we're going to have to do all of it, and try, at least attempt to max out every kind of solution set that you just mentioned there. And so just to go through a few of them, like American cereal production, so corn, soy, wheat, is like 2 or 3 times more productive than the global average. So if you got the rest of the world just up to like existing American standards, not sci-fi stuff, not vertical farms and not like brand new sort of varieties, but just up to American standards, you would spare enormous amounts of land for other purposes. Whether it's sort of rainforests or grasslands or parklands or the other half of eco-modernism, which is we kind of want to intensify human production of nature to spare more and more of the planet for wild nature and for managed nature. So that's one. You mentioned vertical farms. There's a lot of pessimism around vertical farms right now, partly because vertical farms need. Yes, they need they need water and they need pesticides and fertilizers, just like any sort of crop system, but they need way less of that because you can be much more sort of precise with most of your inputs in like a vertical greenhouse. What you need a lot of is energy. You need a lot of electricity for the halogen lights in your greenhouse, and that is just added cost compared to getting your light from the sun in the sky. Now, there's a benefit there, which is that you can have the lights on all day, but most plants don't actually want the light all day. Yes, food that we eat is mostly an invention, sort of like created by humans over eons. But still, most plants expect the sun to go down. And so just like leaving the artificial sun on requires you to sort of tinker with the plant itself in order to make it absorb all that energy. So there's sort of well-founded pessimism for vertical agriculture for those sort of practical reasons, but I do think that it has a future, particularly for kind of leafy greens and some vegetables like strawberries and tomatoes and cucumbers and things like that, which are not a significant share of agriculture and humans' environmental footprint, but they are a particularly inefficient one. Like if you look at the amount of calories you produce with an acre of lettuce compared to an acre of corn, it's almost irrationally different because there aren't any calories in lettuce, right? And so yes, we want to produce lettuce, we want to produce fresh produce, greens, but if you're talking about sort of efficiency of calorie production in land area, it would be great if we could figure out how to move a bunch of the sort of produce and greens production indoors, where it uses far less land and water and fertilizer and pesticides, and that requires a lot of energy. In addition to sort of decarbonizing the energy supply and powering these AI data centers and powering sort of new critical minerals production, if we had sort of mega high energy abundance from like solar and nuclear and natural gas with carbon capture, and all of the technologies that we'll talk about, that we've talked about before, you could do things like desalinate water for agriculture and for municipal water supplies. You could do things like vertical agriculture, and you could actually make those things economical. You also mentioned sort of alternative meats, what we have been advised not to call fake meat, because consumers really don't like that for good
Diner
reason.
meat. Customize the
Yeah.
marbling on your ribeye.
Definitely not in vitro meat, which is another sort of term of art. People are still figuring that out. So, alternative proteins, like the ones people know best, are like Beyond Foods and Impossible Burgers. Kind of really took off. Thanks to really, I think, impressive sort of design and impressive science. Like 5-6 years ago, right? I think Beyond and Impossible in particular got a bit of a windfall from the pandemic, when people were stuck at home and they needed to buy a bunch of frozen food, and there's this new exciting sort of food option in the grocery store. So you're going to buy a bunch of fake meat. That didn't really last. There was a kind of sudden rise and then sudden decline in consumer interest in fake meat. And I think that's because, as good as Impossible and Beyond Burgers are, and I really do like the Impossible Burger in particular, they're not quite as good. I think is the sort of general consumer sentiment, comparing it to a regular beef burger. And in particular, once you get out of like hamburgers and chicken tenders, we just are nowhere close to producing a really good salmon fillet or grilled shrimp or ribeye or chicken thigh, or the things that people find sort of really really tasty and really care about. And those are the kinds of things that will require quite a bit of science to actually produce. I don't know if it's some combination of fermentation and 3D printing that will do it, but those are two of the main kind of processes that these startups and scientists are exploring to actually produce sort of tasty, edible, desirable protein. And if you did that, you would really sort of minimize sort of significant environmental impacts from our food system. Again, the biggest the biggest environmental footprint maybe of anything in the world is cows, right? Who belch methane and who require just a vast amount of land area for grazing. And here again, I would say that sort of organically fed cows actually require sort of more land area for and sort of more inputs for a given amount of meat produced, just because sort of finishing the cattle raising process with grain and feedlots makes them bigger faster, so they're brought to slaughter weight faster, and they spend less time belching methane into the air for a given amount of meat produced. So there again, there's an opportunity to kind of accelerate the industrialization of cattle production to relatively lower its environmental impacts, but you're still talking about an enormous amount of carbon and land area for feeding and producing beef. And so there again, I think we need to both kind of make more efficient our livestock production systems with the animals that we have today, which, not unlike the sort of fruits and vegetables you mentioned earlier, are kind of an invention of the human species at this point. If you look
Yeah,
at
they don't come like that with all
yeah.
that. They don't. That's not how they came. We did that.
Yeah, we did that. And, I think it's a fair argument that it's our responsibility to have some stewardship and some dominion over that. And we do have dominion over the lives of, like over 1 trillion animals, depending on sort of how you count it, especially when you tally up all of the tilapia and shrimp and seafood that humans consume in a given year. It's a really daunting challenge, not just the ecology of it, but the animal welfare, and I think we're going to need to kind of press on all levers to sort of make these systems more efficient, hopefully sort of more humane along the way, while sort of trying to crack that really tricky sort of science and engineering challenge that would finally deliver sort of scalable, sustainable, sort of desirable alternative proteins. So those are a few things, across the sort of horizon of our food future.
On meat, it sounds, Alex Trembath, like you are describing a world where there's more food and less death and more land for people and less global warming, which sounds dangerously positive sum. You can't think like that. But on vertical farming, as you mentioned, you mentioned vertical farming. You might as well put a sign on your forehead that says "Dunk on me." And you've talked about that having a lot to do with energy, and obviously that you guys are in energy, right? So if you get everything you want on energy, we changed the laws. It's legal. You can build nuclear now. AI goes through its booms and busts, but at the end of the day, they build nuclear. Maybe one day we will take climate change as seriously as Richard goddamn Nixon did, more than half century ago, and build a bunch of nuclear plants across the U.S. to make energy cheaper and the climate better. If you get what you want on energy, does that solve the problem with vertical farming? Does that become attainable then?
Yeah, I don't know what the kind of thresholds there are. I am holding out hope that with kind of hyper energy abundance, just like solar farms and nuclear plants dotting the landscape, I think in my imaginary of it, the solar farms will be frankly, a lot more visible than the nuclear plants, which just take up far less space, and you can kind of bury them under like parking lots.
Yeah.
But either way, we have a lot more sort of hyper abundant electricity. I don't see why a certain amount of, again, probably like greens and produce production indoors becomes more economical. It would surprise me, based on my kind of surface level review of the scientific literature here, if we ever produce corn or soy or grow like cattle equivalents indoors. But I wouldn't bet against sort of surprising amounts of innovation here, especially once you start talking not in the years but in the decades and sort of centuries time scale. Again, 150 years ago, we knew that we might have known that the atmosphere was 70% nitrogen, but we still fought wars over bird poop in the southern hemisphere because there's this weird collection of dry islands where it just collected. And then as soon as we, and by we I mean sort of Europeans, sort of industrially discovered guano, we started to run out of it. And scientists were scrambling to figure out, well, there's all this nitrogen in the atmosphere, but we can't get to it. And so these scientists in Germany, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, sort of got together and came up with the aptly named Haber-Bosch process, which fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere into ammonia fertilizer. Again, that would have sounded like gobbledygook, would have sounded like magic 150, 200 years ago.
Still does.
Yeah, right. Yeah. When you actually start to talk about, fusing two atoms together to release gobsmacking amounts of thermal energy and then turning that into electricity. Like these technologies are really magical. And I like to remind myself of that when I think not like 5 or 10 or even 25 years down the road, but when I think 50 or 100 or 200 years down the road. Not that I expect to be around to experience it, but I do start to kind of shed some of my pragmatism and certainly some of my pessimism around the agricultural and industrial and energy and urban sort of processes that we take for granted today.
Hey, maybe one day, maybe soon, the world will look like the cover of the Abundance book, which I thought should have more skyscrapers, but they didn't ask me. So your website, again, we talked about a couple things: climate and energy, environmental regulatory reform, nuclear energy innovation. We've talked about food and agriculture. You also have energy for development. And your headline on that page is Confronting Green Colonialism and Western Hypocrisy. Very spicy. What does that mean?
Yeah, so energy for development is our way of talking about sort of energy and agricultural actually development in low and middle income countries. And our sort of policy proposition there is that due to, again, a kind of misguided, I think, environmentalist impulse in international aid in global development, there have been sort of like legal and sort of non-legal restrictions made on investments in energy infrastructure and food systems in poor countries for decades and generations. So there have been sort of bans on hydroelectric, fossil fuel, nuclear energy investments by places like the World Bank and the European Development Bank, and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and other sort of multilateral finance organizations that were sort of created to help sort of accelerate industrialization, sort of labor force expansion, sort of technology transfer in the poorest parts of the world. But we have sort of placed these restrictions on the sort of types of technology, energy, and infrastructure that we really allow sort of our poor neighbors in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America to have access to, while still enjoying those technologies ourselves. So, I mean, if you look at the U.S. energy system, we use everything. We've got 20% of our electricity coming from nuclear. We've got another 20 odd percent coming from wind and solar. We've got 40% coming from natural gas, 7 or 8% from hydrogen, and the rest of it coming from a little bit of coal and geothermal. And sort of most of those technologies, at least until recently, when there's been a sort of reform movement to fix what we consider a pretty great injustice here. So most aid and development finance have been restricted to most of those technologies. So our Energy for Development program has been focused on fixing that by sort of engaging lawmakers in Congress and engaging the rule makers at places like the World Bank, and the European Development Bank, and other multilateral finance institutions, and also by just emphasizing the really central importance of energy infrastructure to economic development. There's this other kind of model of really sort of energy access and international aid, which says, look, if you just sort of install like solar panels and microgrids in these poor villages in poor countries, then you're providing energy access, and you can kind of leapfrog over the fossil fueled industrialization that we benefited from in Europe and in East Asia and in the United States and beyond. And our view there is that that will not work. That it was better than not to have, a solar panel on your home, and it's better than not to have a clean cook stove in your home. But what sort of drove economic growth, improvements in human welfare in really every country around the world is urbanization, industrialization, and agricultural modernization. And those require lots and lots of energy. And, to put a fine point on it, lots and lots of oil and natural gas. Maybe a lot less coal than Germany, the UK, and the United States used, fortunately. But we're still using quite a bit of oil and natural gas in the United States. And we've been arguing for a very long time at this point that it is just one of the more screwed up injustices in the world, that we're telling the poorest people on the planet that we're going to restrict access to the same technologies that we still benefit from. So that's, in a big nutshell, what our Energy for Development program is focused on.
In terms of oil and natural gas, it seems like there is what would you call it? Almost like a carbon like a dirty energy investment that's needed in order to have clean energy, which is to say, if you want wind turbines and solar power and all this stuff, some amount of the manufacturing for that does take the dirty, shitty, crappy oil and natural gas. And so if you want to reap the benefits of clean technology, there is a sort of like very short-term sacrifice in order to have the, let's call it, return on investment of a better, safer world and climate later. Is that right? How do you think about where the most polluting energy factors into today and then the sort of coming decades? What's the right way to think about how that fits into a wider and greener system?
there's a couple angles on it. It's a really, I think, well formulated question, Steve. So actually, you actually sort of maybe, I think, stumbled upon the right terminology there, which is a term called EROI, energy return on investment, and that is an attempt to kind of calculate all of the sort of input energy that goes into producing an energy producing technology, and sort of doing a sort of cost and benefit calculation there. So if you have a solar panel that produces however many megawatt hours of electricity over its lifespan, well, how many megawatt hours of electricity went into producing that panel, and what is a large surplus is your EROI. But the size of that surplus is different from technology to technology. So on the one hand, you're very right that we do actually need significant amounts of industrial energy, electricity in particular, but also, the sort of steel and concrete and glass and copper that go into producing nuclear reactors and solar panels and wind turbines and batteries. We need energy to produce those raw and engineered inputs in the first place. And we need we need fossil fuels still for most of the stuff that we do, as far as we can tell. So there's a push in energy and climate spaces to, quote, electrify everything, right? Which, and directionally, I think is a great goal. If if you can electrify sort of vehicles and furnaces and boilers and stoves and ovens and things that currently run on something like gasoline or kerosene or natural gas, then you can just sort of plug everything into the grid, and build lots of solar and lots of nuclear, and sort of run our homes and at least our personal vehicles with electricity. The problem is that that's a minority of what we use our energy for. Sort of like most of the energy we use goes to the industrial and agricultural and sort of bulk transportation systems, and those are still sort of heavily reliant on especially oil and natural gas, not just for fuel but for sort of process input. So you need coal to produce steel, at least at scale right now, and there's sort of startup arc furnaces to try and use electricity to create steel, and similar kind of innovative designs to produce low carbon concrete and low carbon glass and things like that. But at the moment, the best way that we know to produce steel and copper or to produce steel and glass and plastics and other petroleum inputs and other sort of petrochemicals, and pharmaceuticals, is using fossil fuels as an input, and meanwhile sort of using natural gas, especially for when the sun isn't shining and the sun isn't blowing on our electricity grids. Now we're kind of attempting to solve that whole terrain of problems. Like, we are getting better at building and deploying batteries that can store excess renewable energy for when the sun goes down or when the sun isn't, or when the wind isn't blowing for a few hours of the day. We're trying hard to make sort of longer duration energy storage economical. We are working on electrifying technologies that currently use kerosene or gasoline. We're making progress in some places, like with thermal heat pumps and with electric vehicles, Tesla and Rivian and all these things. But it's really hard. That's really the upshot for me at the end of all these conversations, is that this is hard, not easy. There's a hard industrial and engineering and policy challenge that will mostly happen pretty slowly. Like, we see really exciting and increasingly kind of like visible signs of progress. Like, you can see Teslas out in the world all over the place, at least here in the Bay Area right now, right? And you can see solar panels. I hope in the not too distant future we start to see, if you drive to the right place, really cool geothermal drilling sites. And I hope that we start to see micro reactors sort of dotting the landscape, and that more of this decarbonizing infrastructure becomes visible and exciting to us. But really, you're talking about, to your point, Steve, the next rung up the energy ladder. And it's just like, it would not have been possible. It wouldn't have been feasible to like do the Manhattan Project without industrializing first. It wouldn't be conceivable to like create fake meat if we hadn't figured out how to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And so, to the original sort of impetus behind your question, telling, I think, poor countries that they can't rely on not just those fossil fuels, but those processes, and telling them that they can just leapfrog directly to solar panels on their rooftop to power a cell phone and a light and maybe a cook stove. I think it's just profoundly unjust. And also sort of really misunderstands the nature of economic growth, of energy systems and energy transitions, and the nature of climate action and what decarbonization is actually going to look like.
This has been, this has been an amazingly fun conversation. I'm once again honored to spend the time with you and get to hear about the Abundance Conference and the meaning of events in politics and food and agriculture and justice in climate and energy technology for the world. As we come to a very close here, I'm curious, Abundance Conference is about to happen and it's also sold out. For anyone that's either finding out about it in this episode or was like, oh, I was going to go to that. What do you mean it's sold out? That's scarcity, Alex. We need bigger, taller venues with more capacity. Next year, it's happening. For anybody who now is interested now, how can they make sure they go next year? How can they follow along? How can they get involved? How do they plug in?
Get on the wait list, follow the website. We'll be sure to keep anyone sort of who signs up for the wait list appraised of future gatherings, future events. And then beyond that, I would literally just go and sign up for the newsletter of all 15 co-hosts who will talk about the sort of future of the abundance movement, about the future of any abundance events, including the conference, but not just the conference. I would say that if you're in New England, a couple weeks after Abundance, YIMBY Town is just a few weeks later for our housing listeners. If you're in the Bay Area, there's a Progress Summit in Berkeley, which I believe also has a waiting list. And so I hope that all of these events continue and take place in much taller, more capacious buildings in the future. And there are just a bunch of really cool institutions where you can follow along now.
Amazing. Alex, thanks for spending time today. I'll see you in a couple weeks. And thanks for joining us on Radio Abundance.
I'll see you in DC, Steve. Thank you so much for having me on again. This was great.